Hey folks, welcome back to My Kitten Reads. I'm Eleanor and this is my June wrap up. I actually did read 13 things in June. The problem with reading 13 things in June is that a lot of them were rereads because I was in a bit of a slump, and a lot of the rest, pretty much most of the rest, were short stories. But it's Hugo Award reading time of the year, so that's kind of to be expected. Anyway, so the one actual new novel that I read in June was The Big Sleep by Raymond and Chandler, which was the final book that I had to read for my Gothic literature class. Because Gothic literature is very closely entwined, as I learned, with detective fiction, and uses the early detective fiction uses a lot of sort of tropes around Gothic literature. Wasn't a big fan. I don't think hard-boiled, gritty detectives are my thing. I'm more of a cozy crime kind of person. But yeah, it's basically one of his Philip Marlowe mysteries. And so this private detective in Los Angeles, Philip Marlowe, is working for the Sternwood family. He's been asked to investigate a blackmailer, and he stumbles across a murder or two. And yeah, the Sternwood family, especially the two Wilde daughters, this is in like 1920s Los Angeles or something like that, are very mixed up in it. And yeah, it's gritty, it's hard, and none of the characters are particularly likeable, and just not really my thing. But you know, at least I can now say I've read a Raymond Chandler. The rest of what I read was digital, so let me just open my Goodreads. So I reread a whole bunch of Jane Austen variations, because that's kind of my go-to when I'm stuck in fan fiction and I'm not really reading anything. So if I will just list them off, because you've probably heard me talk about them before. I reread Tapestry of Lives, volumes 1, 2 and 3 by Jean Simmons. This is set partway through Pride and Prejudice, and things got a little bit differently, and then it goes beyond the marriage of Elizabeth and Darcy, and very much includes a lot of flashbacks about their families and a lot of what it's like to be part of like the upper classes in London society. So there's a lot of Darcy's like Fitzwilliam relatives, his uncle the Earl and his children, and all that kind of stuff. I also reread Revisit Mansfield Park, How Fanny Married Henry by Sarah Ozcandarli. There are very few Mansfield Park variations available, and most of the ones I've tried to read I haven't liked, but this one I quite do, and so it's just a little bit different. So in this one, instead of Henry just leaving Fanny in Portsmouth, he says, why don't we correspond? Because I have changed and I'd like to prove it to you, but I understand that you don't believe that. And so they correspond and their relationship changes thanks to that. And so I actually really like that one. I reread Vanities and Vexations by Sarah J. Wldock, which is a post Pride and Prejudice sequel, where they're bringing out Georgiana and Kitty. The Darcys are bringing them out into London society. Mary comes along too, and Berg ends up staying with them. And, you know, it's their various romantic shenanigans. It's not particularly well written, but I still really like the characterizations. So there's that. I reread, for the first time in a while, The Companion of His Future Life by Jack Caldwell, which was one of the very early pieces of fan fiction in Pride and Prejudice fandom that I really got into, and it was then published. And so this one is one where Mary marries Mr. Collins and how that changes interactions between various characters, although the ending is still, you know, the usual. And I reread An Unlikely Friendship by Jann Rowland, which is about what if Caroline Bingley was already engaged when they went to Netherfield and had in fact but grown up with the Darcys and so considered them siblings rather than a romantic pursuit, and how that would change, particularly if she ended up making friends with Elizabeth eventually. So those were those, and the rest of what I read was basically the short story category for the Hugo Awards, which I read over a weekend So that included Carnival 9 by Carolyn M. Yoachim. If I'm remembering that one correctly, yes, it's about a bunch of people who are, they seem to be toys that are wind-up toys, and so everyone has a certain amount of turns per day, depending on how well their springs last and how well they've been wound up. And it's about one particular toy who has a lot of wind-up, a lot of turns per day, and so can therefore do a lot. But how you still have to manage that, because things can happen in your life, which means you have to give up, which means even having a lot of turns doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to do everything you need to do. So yeah, that was alright. I read Clearly Lettered in a Most Steady Hand by Fran Wilde, which off the top of my head I cannot remember what it was about. That's probably not a good sign. Yeah. Fandom for Robots by Jie-Min Prasad. So this was a far future one where you have a robot who is part of a museum collection and who's one of the very early AIs, and he discovers this fandom of this like anime type thing, where there's this robot and he starts reading fan fiction randomly and decides that the robot isn't very well characterized in these romances, and so starts both writing their own and collaborating with another artist, and so it's sort of in documents and IM conversations and emails and stuff. And it was pretty interesting. The Martian Obelisk I really quite liked. It was really a quite hopeful story. It was post-apocalyptic, sort of not apocalyptic, I guess, but the world is basically dying out and humanity's dying out because the world is overpolluted and all that kind of stuff. There aren't many people around. And it's about this scientist who's running this project because the various Mars colonies failed. And she's got an architect and she's building this monument, this obelisk on Mars using machinery and stuff. And during the course of running that project, an alert pops up and it turns out, there might be a survivor of one of the Mars colonies, and how that changes her perspective on what she's doing. And it's actually kind of hopeful, which I quite like about sort of dystopian stuff. I also was very interested, I think, by Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience by Rebecca Roanhorse. So this is about a Native American person who's working for a virtual experience tourist company, and so basically he plays the role of an authentic Indian for tourists in a virtual world. But this has pitfalls, and so it's a lot. It's really a lot about what is an authentic Indigenous experience, I guess. So in this case, it's talking about Native Americans, but I could totally see it also fitting in the Indigenous Australian context with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so it's like it's the difference between the authentic experience that those people actually live on a day-to-day basis in the modern world, and the authentic experience that tourists expect. And there's it's very different in between that. So what is an authentic experience? So I found that very interesting on an intellectual level. And so that was the last of the short stories that I had read. And so that is what I read in June. Not hugely interesting. Not a lot of variety really, but yeah, not too bad for a slump. So I'm still reading not a lot, but there is an extra Dewey's Readathon happening at the end of this month that they've announced, which is sort of a reverse readathon, and the reversing is actually in the timing, and that's actually going to make things work out better for me, which is really good. So it's the last weekend this month, so I am going to participate in that as best I can. I do have theatre plans during it, but I'm hoping that it'll let me do a lot of more Hugo reading. So that's my June wrap up. There will not be a June book haul because the only thing I acquired during June was the Crate, which has its own video. So yeah, I guess I'll have to come up with something else for June. We'll see what happens next weekend. I'll see you all again soon. Bye.